Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
In lateness and incompetence, the room fell silent. Arthur Ferraz, a man in his early 40s with impeccably tailored suits and piercing hazel eyes, was known for his ruthlessness. Under his leadership, Ferraz Corporation had transformed from a struggling family business into a multi-million-euro empire spanning real estate, fashion, and tech. His methods, however, were as harsh as his ascent was meteoric. As if on cue, the heavy oak doors creaked open, and an older woman entered, clutching a leather-bound notebook. Beatriz Rossi, her hair a crown of silver curls, wore a simple yet elegant dress. Her demeanor was calm but apologetic as she walked to the only empty chair at the table. "Signor Ferraz, I apologize for—" Arthur raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough. You've wasted enough of our time already." Beatriz stopped mid-step, her face reddening. She lowered her eyes and sat at the far end of the table, her movements deliberate but dignified. The tension in the room thickened as Arthur leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table. "I run this company like a clock, Signora Rossi. A single cog out of sync, and the whole mechanism fails. Do you understand that?" His voice was sharp, almost venomous. "Yes, Signor Ferraz," Beatriz replied softly, her Italian accent carrying a touch of warmth despite the coldness she faced. "Then explain to me why you, the so-called assistant archivist, cannot manage something as basic as punctuality." Beatriz opened her notebook, her hands trembling slightly, but before she could answer, Arthur stood, his voice rising. "No excuses," he barked, startling several executives. "This is not a charity. I will not tolerate mediocrity, no matter how long you've been with this company. Effective immediately, you're dismissed." A gasp rippled through the room. Beatriz froze, her hand mid-turn on a page. For a moment, her gaze met Arthur's, and something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment, sadness, but not defeat. "Very well," she said after a pause, her voice steady. "If that is your decision, Signor Ferraz." Arthur expected protest or pleading. Instead, she stood, gathered her notebook, and exited the room with the same grace she had entered. The door closed behind her with a soft click. The meeting resumed, but the atmosphere was strained. Arthur moved swiftly through the agenda, assigning tasks and issuing orders with his usual efficiency. Yet, an uneasy silence lingered, unspoken questions hovering in the air. Many in the room had worked alongside Beatriz for years. Some even owed her their positions. But no one dared challenge Arthur. His authority was absolute. By the time the meeting ended, Arthur felt a flicker of irritation he couldn't quite place. He dismissed it as annoyance over the interruption and retreated to his private office. Arthur's office was a sanctuary of power and wealth. The shelves were lined with rare books, many in Italian and Latin, their spines gleaming under the soft light. On his desk, a glass sculpture of a rearing stallion, his family crest, reflected the sunlight streaming through the windows. He sank into his chair, scrolling through his emails, but his thoughts drifted back to Beatriz. "Why did she look at me like that?" he muttered to himself. The memory of her unwavering gaze lingered, unsettling him. That evening, Arthur attended a gala at the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II, a glittering event filled with Milan's elite. The city's fashion magnates, politicians, and artists mingled under the grand glass dome, their laughter and clinking glasses echoing through the historic arcade. Arthur, ever the charmer, moved effortlessly through the crowd, but his mind remained preoccupied. "Arthur, you seem distracted," said Claudia Bernardi, a sharp-witted journalist and an old acquaintance. "Problems at the Empire?" "Nothing I can't handle," he replied smoothly, but Claudia raised an eyebrow. "I heard about Beatriz Rossi," she said. "She's worked for your company for decades, hasn't she?" Arthur sipped his champagne, his expression unreadable. She was no longer fit for her role. Claudia studied him for a moment before leaning in. You know, my grandmother used to say that every person carries a story. Sometimes, it's worth hearing it before you make judgments. Arthur chuckled, though uneasily. A charming sentiment, Claudia, but this is business. Claudia shrugged, a knowing smile on her lips. Just don't forget, Arthur. The past has a way of catching up with us. Later that night, Arthur returned to his penthouse overlooking the Navigli canals. The city lights reflected on the water, a picturesque scene that usually brought him a sense of control. But as he loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of wine, the day's events replayed in his mind. He searched the company database for Beatriz Rossi. Her personnel file was sparse: dates of employment, positions held, a few commendations. No family details, no photographs. Just a single note: hired by request of Julio Ferraz, 1982. Arthur frowned. His father had founded the company, but he rarely involved himself in personnel decisions. What had made Beatriz special? And why had she accepted her dismissal so quietly? Unable to shake his curiosity, Arthur clicked on a link to the company archives. Rows of scanned documents filled the screen, each dated and indexed meticulously. He typed her name into the search bar. The results were unexpected. Beatriz's name appeared in old financial records, mentioned in connection with loans and property acquisitions dating back to the 1980s. Arthur leaned closer, his brow furrowing. Many of these transactions were tied to pivotal moments in the company's history, moments he had always attributed to his father's genius. "What is this?" he muttered, his mind racing. The clock struck midnight as Arthur stared at the screen, a sense of unease growing in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was missing a piece of a puzzle, one that could unravel everything he thought he knew. The morning sun bathed Milan in a golden glow, its light reflecting off the cobblestones of Via Monte Napoleone, the city's renowned fashion street. Arthur Ferraz, however, remained oblivious to the beauty outside. Seated at his expansive mahogany desk, he stared at his computer screen, eyes scanning line after line of financial records and company memos from decades past. Despite his best efforts, sleep had eluded him the previous night. Beatriz Rossi's quiet departure, her composed demeanor, and the cryptic connection between her and his father lingered in his thoughts. Arthur's office door swung open, breaking his concentration. Matteo Ricci, his trusted executive assistant, entered, carrying a thick folder. "Buongiorno, Signor Ferraz," Matteo began, setting the folder down with a thud. "These are the contracts for the Siena acquisition you requested. Everything appears in order." Arthur waved a dismissive hand. "Leave it for now. I need you to focus on something else." Matteo blinked, caught off guard by his employer's unusually distracted tone. "Of course. What do you need?" "Beatriz Rossi. I want everything you can find about her." Arthur leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Her employment history, personal life, connections, especially anything tying her to my father." Matteo hesitated. "Signora Rossi? She's been with the company for years." I didn't ask for your opinion, Matteo," Arthur interrupted sharply. "Just do it." "Yes, Signor Ferraz," Matteo replied, backing out of the room. Once alone, Arthur opened a drawer and retrieved an old photograph he had found during a restless search through his family's personal archives that morning. The sepia-toned image depicted a younger Julio Ferraz standing in front of the family's villa in Lake Como, flanked by several people. Beatriz was unmistakable, standing slightly to the side, her expression serene yet confident. "Who are you, Beatriz?" Arthur murmured, his gaze fixed on her face. The day stretched on, filled with meetings and calls, but Arthur's mind wandered back to his discoveries. Late in the afternoon, Matteo returned with a thick envelope, his expression both puzzled and curious. "I managed to find some records," Matteo said, setting the envelope on the desk. but a lot of her personal history seems incomplete. Arthur opened the envelope and began leafing through the contents. There were documents detailing Beatriz's employment, letters of recommendation, and even handwritten notes from his father praising her diligence and loyalty. But what caught Arthur's attention was a series of legal documents tied to the purchase of properties during the 1980s, assets that had been instrumental in rescuing Ferraz Corporation from financial ruin. "What's this?" Arthur asked, holding up a contract bearing Beatriz's signature. Matteo adjusted his glasses. "That's from 1984. It appears Signora Rossi personally guaranteed a loan to acquire a textile factory when the company was on the brink of collapse. Without her intervention, Ferraz Corporation might not have survived." Arthur felt a cold weight settle in his chest. His father had never mentioned this. Growing up, Arthur had idolized Giulio Ferraz, viewing him as the epitome of resilience and success. To learn that their family's empire had depended on an archivist's generosity shook the foundation of that belief. Why would she do that? Arthur asked aloud, though the question was more to himself than Matteo. "There's more," Matteo added hesitantly. "I spoke to a few retired employees who worked with her during that time. They all described her as indispensable. Some even suggested she was closer to your father than anyone realized." Arthur's brow furrowed. "Closer? In what way?" Matteo hesitated, clearly reluctant to speculate. "I don't know, Signor Ferraz. But it might be worth investigating further." Later that evening, Arthur found himself driving north, away from Milan's bustling center and toward the serene shores of Lake Como. The family villa, now mostly abandoned save for occasional staff visits, loomed ahead like a relic of another era. The ornate gates creaked open as his car approached, revealing the sprawling estate nestled amid lush gardens and cypress trees. Arthur parked and stepped out, the cool evening air carrying the faint scent of jasmine. Memories flooded back as he ascended the stone steps and entered the villa. The grand foyer, with its intricate mosaics and chandeliers, seemed untouched by time. He could almost hear the echo of his father's voice, lecturing him on the importance of legacy and tradition. But tonight, Arthur wasn't here for nostalgia. He headed straight to the study, a room that had once been his father's sanctuary. Rows of books lined the walls, and an antique desk sat beneath a large window overlooking the lake. Arthur began searching through drawers and cabinets, hoping to find more clues about Beatriz. Hours passed, and frustration mounted as he sifted through documents, many of which seemed irrelevant. Then, in a hidden compartment at the back of a drawer, he found a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Giulio Ferraz. Flipping through its yellowed pages, Arthur read entries detailing his father's struggles during the company's early years. One entry, dated 1983, stood out. "Beatriz has once again proven herself invaluable. Her insight into the market is unparalleled, and her willingness to invest in this family's vision humbles me. I owe her more than I can ever repay." Arthur's heart raced as he continued reading. The entries painted a picture of a deep bond between Giulio and Beatriz, one built on trust, mutual respect, and shared ambition. There was no hint of romance, but the closeness of their relationship was undeniable. The final entry mentioning Beatriz, dated 1985, was particularly striking. "I fear Arthur will never understand the sacrifices others have made for his future. Beatriz, above all, has given everything without asking for recognition. She deserves more than this world can offer her." Arthur closed the journal, his mind swirling with questions. How had he never known any of this? Why had his father kept it hidden? The next morning, Arthur returned to Milan, his determination hardened. He instructed Matteo to contact Beatriz, but she was nowhere to be found. Her phone number had been disconnected, and her small apartment in Porta Romana was empty. It was as though she had vanished. Frustrated, Arthur reached out to Claudia Bernardi, the journalist he had spoken to at the gala. If anyone could uncover information, it was her. "Arthur Ferraz, Claudia greeted him over the phone. "To what do I owe this unexpected call?" "I need your help," Arthur said bluntly. "It's about Beatriz Rossi." There was a pause on the other end before Claudia replied, "Interesting. What's changed?" "Just find her," Arthur said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever it takes." Claudia agreed, but her parting words lingered. "Careful, Arthur. You might not like what you find." As the days passed, Arthur's obsession with Beatriz grew. The more he uncovered about her contributions to his family's success, the more guilt gnawed at him. He replayed their final interaction in his mind, her calm acceptance of his cruel words, and wondered how he could have been so blind. One evening, while poring over old photographs from the villa, Arthur noticed a small detail he had overlooked before. In one of the images, Beatriz stood beside a young boy, himself as a child. She was smiling down at him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. It was a fleeting moment captured on film, but it spoke volumes. "She was there all along," Arthur whispered, a pang of regret hitting him like a wave. "And I never even noticed." The air was crisp and cool as Arthur stepped off the train in Bellagio, a picturesque village on the shores of Lake Como. Though his family's villa sat farther up the winding roads, Arthur had chosen this particular route in the hopes of clearing his mind. The tranquil waters of the lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, their calm surface at odds with the turmoil in his chest. 4 days, Arthur had been grappling with the weight of his discoveries about Beatriz Rossi. Despite Claudia Bernardi's diligent efforts, Beatriz's trail had gone cold. The more unreachable she seemed, the more her absence gnawed at him. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. Yet here he was, chasing the shadow of a woman he'd dismissed so easily. As he strolled along the cobblestone streets, Arthur's gaze wandered over the colorful facades of lakeside buildings, their balconies overflowing with blooming geraniums. Bellagio had always been one of his favorite places in Italy, a blend of elegance and rustic charm. Today, however, it offered little comfort. Turning a corner, Arthur's steps faltered as he spotted a familiar figure in the distance. There, outside a small cafe, sat Beatriz Rossi. She was dressed simply in a lavender blouse and gray slacks, her silver hair catching the sunlight. A steaming cup of coffee rested in front of her as she scribbled something into a notebook. Arthur's heart thudded in his chest. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. She hadn't seen him yet, her focus entirely on the page before her. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself and crossed the street. "Signora Rossi," he called out, his voice more uncertain than he intended. Beatriz looked up, her pen pausing mid-stroke. Her expression shifted from surprise to calm recognition, though there was no warmth in her gaze. "Signor Ferraz," she replied evenly, closing her notebook. "This is unexpected." "I could say the same," Arthur said, taking the seat opposite her without waiting for an invitation. The cafe's wrought iron chair creaked slightly under his weight, and he felt a flicker of discomfort under her measured stare. "What brings you to Bellagio?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Arthur hesitated, grappling with how to begin. "I've been looking for you." Beatriz raised an eyebrow. "Looking for me? I can't imagine why." Her words stung, though Arthur knew he deserved them. "I've learned some things about you, about your contributions to my family and our company." Beatriz's expression softened, though only slightly. She took a sip of her coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care. "And what, exactly, have you learned?" "That you were far more than an employee," Arthur admitted. "That without you, my father's vision, and everything we have today, wouldn't have been possible." Beatriz sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Your father was a good man, Signor Ferraz. He believed in me when others didn't. I simply returned the favor." Arthur leaned forward, his voice dropping. "But why? Why did you give so much without asking for anything in return?" Beatriz's eyes clouded with memory, and for a moment she seemed lost in the past. Giulio was not like most men of his time, she began. He saw potential in people, no matter their background or circumstances. When I first met him, I was a widow with little more than a sharp mind and a will to survive. He gave me a chance, and for that, I owed him everything. Arthur remained silent, absorbing her words. He had always viewed his father as a titan, a larger-than-life figure who built an empire with sheer determination. To hear Beatriz describe him with such humility was jarring. "But I'm not here to discuss the past," Beatriz continued, her voice firm. "What's done is done. You made your decision, and I've accepted it." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I was wrong, Signora Rossi. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Beatriz studied him, her sharp eyes searching his face. "Do you truly believe that, or are you simply feeling guilty now that you've uncovered the truth?" The question cut deeper than Arthur expected. He thought about the humiliation he had inflicted on her, the casual cruelty with which he had dismissed her years of service. His pride resisted the admission, but his conscience demanded it. "I was arrogant," he confessed, his voice quieter now, "and blind to what truly matters. You deserved better, far better than what I gave you." Beatriz tilted her head, as though weighing the sincerity of his words. After a long pause, she said, "Regret is a powerful teacher, Signor Ferraz. But it means nothing unless it leads to change." Arthur nodded, her words sinking in like stones. "I want to make amends," he said. "Not just to you, but to everyone I've wronged in my pursuit of success." Beatriz's lips quirked in a faint smile. "That's a noble sentiment. But words alone won't suffice." "What can I do?" Arthur asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Tell me how to make this right." Beatriz considered him for a moment, then gestured to the notebook she had been writing in. "Do you know what I've been doing since I left your company?" Arthur shook his head. "I've been compiling a history," she said, tapping the cover of the notebook. "Not just of Ferraz Corporation, but of the people who built it. The workers, the architects, the unsung heroes. Your father understood the value of those people, even if you've forgotten it." Her words stung, but Arthur nodded. "I want to help. Let me publish your work as part of the company's legacy." Beatriz raised an eyebrow. "And what would that accomplish?" "It would show the truth," Arthur said earnestly. "It would remind everyone, including myself, that this company isn't just about profits and power. It's about people." Beatriz studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Very well. But only if you promise me one thing." "Anything," Arthur said. "Promise me you'll listen," she said, her voice firm. "Not just to me, but to everyone who works for you. Their stories matter as much as yours." Arthur extended his hand across the table. "I promise." Beatriz hesitated, then shook his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. As they parted ways, Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he knew his journey was far from over. Beatriz had given him a chance, not just to make amends, but to become the kind of leader his father would have been proud of. As the sun set over Lake Como, casting its golden glow across the water, Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The journey back to Milan from Bellagio was marked by an unusual quiet. Arthur Ferraz, a man known for filling his hours with calls and emails, now stared out the window of his private car as the scenic landscapes blurred past. His encounter with Beatriz Rossi had left him reflective, grappling with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel: regret, humility, and a gnawing curiosity about the full truth of her connection to his father. Upon reaching his penthouse, Arthur didn't bother with his usual routine. Instead, he headed straight to the study, where Giulio Ferraz's journal lay on the desk. He opened it again, flipping through the pages with greater urgency. The entries painted a vivid picture of his father as a man who relied heavily on Beatriz, not only for her financial support but for her keen insights and unwavering loyalty. One entry stood out. Beatriz has shown me yet again the power of trust. When others doubted me, she stepped forward, offering both wisdom and resources to keep the company afloat. She has become the backbone of this enterprise, though I fear she will never take credit for it. Arthur's chest tightened as he read the words. His father's admiration for Beatriz was evident, and it unsettled him how blind he had been to her significance. Why had she remained in the shadows all these years? Why had she never sought recognition? The next day, Arthur requested a meeting with Claudia Bernardi. They met at a quiet cafe near Piazza del Duomo, away from prying eyes. Claudia, as always, was sharp and inquisitive, her notepad ready for whatever revelations Arthur was about to share. "I found her," Arthur began, sipping an espresso, "in Bellagio." Claudia arched an eyebrow. "And we talked. She told me a little about her past, about my father. But I need more," he admitted. "There are gaps in the story, parts she won't share. I need your help to fill them." Claudia tapped her pen against the notepad thoughtfully. "Beatriz Rossi isn't the type to leave loose ends, Arthur. If she hasn't told you everything, it's because she believes you're not ready to hear it." Arthur frowned. "And how do I prove that I am?" "You start by listening," Claudia said with a wry smile. "The answers you're looking for might not come from Beatriz directly. They might be hidden in the stories of those who worked alongside her." Her suggestion sparked an idea. Arthur leaned forward, his mind racing. "The archives," he murmured. "She mentioned she's been writing a history of the company. If she won't tell me the full truth, maybe her work will." Returning to Ferraz Corporation's headquarters, Arthur bypassed his usual procession of meetings and headed straight to the archival department. The room, tucked away in the basement, was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern design of the rest of the building. Rows of metal shelves held decades' worth of records, files, and photographs, each meticulously catalogued. The department manager, a reserved man named Pietro, looked startled as Arthur entered. "Signor Ferraz? This is unexpected. I need access to Beatriz Rossi's work," Arthur said without preamble. "Everything she's been compiling over the years." Pietro hesitated, glancing nervously at the rows of shelves. "Her notebooks and files are extensive, sir. She was very particular about her work." "I don't care how long it takes," Arthur said firmly. "I want to see all of it." Within an hour, Arthur was seated at a large table surrounded by stacks of binders and handwritten notes. Beatriz's meticulous handwriting covered page after page, detailing not just the company's milestones but the lives of the people who had contributed to them. Each story was a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and ingenuity. One file caught his eye, a thick binder marked 1985, Villa Salver. Arthur opened it, finding a series of documents detailing the acquisition of a property during one of the company's darkest periods. The villa, located in the outskirts of Milan, had been purchased under unusual circumstances. Beatriz's name appeared repeatedly in the paperwork, listed as a co-investor alongside Giulio Ferraz. A letter slipped between the pages drew his attention. It was addressed to his father, written in Beatriz's neat cursive. "Giulio, I've done what you asked, though I hope you understand the risk involved. This villa holds more than just financial value. It is a symbol of the sacrifices we've made and the lives we've touched. Protect it, not for the company, but for the people who depend on it. Beatriz." Arthur's brow furrowed as he read the words. What was so significant about this villa? And why had his father enlisted Beatriz's help to secure it? Driven by curiosity, Arthur decided to visit the property himself. The villa, tucked away in a quiet countryside, was a sprawling estate surrounded by vineyards and olive groves. Despite its beauty, there was an air of abandonment. The gates were rusted and the gardens overgrown. As Arthur stepped inside, the scent of aged wood and dust greeted him. The interior was remarkably well preserved, with ornate frescoes and antique furniture hinting at its former grandeur. But it was the study, a room similar to his father's at the Lake Como villa, that held the answers he sought. On the desk lay a locked wooden box. Arthur searched the room, eventually finding a small key hidden in a drawer. His heart raced as he opened the box, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and documents. Among them was a faded photograph of Giulio, Beatriz, and a group of workers standing in front of the villa. They looked triumphant, as though they had just achieved something monumental. Beneath the photograph was a letter from Giulio to Beatriz. Beatriz, this villa represents the heart of what we've built. It is a sanctuary for those who have given their all to Ferraz Corporation. I hope that one day Arthur will come to understand its true value, not as an asset, but as a legacy of the people who made it possible. If he ever doubts, remind him of the sacrifices you've made and of the bond we share. Arthur sank into a chair, the letter trembling in his hands. His father's words carried a weight he hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just about the company, it was about the lives intertwined with its history, lives like Beatriz's. For the first time, Arthur felt the full weight of his father's expectations. He had spent his life chasing power and success, blind to the humanity behind the numbers. Beatriz hadn't just been a loyal employee. She had been the embodiment of everything his father had stood for. Arthur left the villa as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the countryside in hues of gold and amber. He had come seeking answers and left with a newfound purpose. Beatriz's story, and the stories of countless others, deserve to be told, not as footnotes in a corporate history but as the foundation of everything Ferraz Corporation represented. For Arthur, the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt he was heading in the right direction. Arthur Ferraz returned to Milan with a newfound clarity, yet his chest felt heavier than ever. The truths he had uncovered about Beatriz Rossi and her pivotal role in shaping his family's empire were both humbling and damning. He had prided himself on being a visionary leader, yet he had trampled on the very foundations that allowed him to rise. Back in his penthouse, the city stretched out below him, lights flickering like distant stars. But the view that had once symbolized his dominance now felt hollow. Beatriz's calm but piercing words during their last encounter echoed in his mind. Regret means nothing unless it leads to change. Arthur resolved to act. He needed to find Beatriz again, not just to apologize but to ensure she knew how deeply he now valued her contributions. He dialed Claudia Bernardi, who picked up on the second ring. "Arthur, calling twice in 1 week?" "I'm flattered," Claudia quipped. "I need your help again," Arthur said without preamble. "I found something significant at the villa. Letters, documents, all pointing to Beatriz's sacrifices and her bond with my father. But I need to speak with her. She needs to know." Claudia paused, then sighed. "Arthur, I warned you before. Beatriz isn't someone who will simply accept an apology and move on. If you want to make amends, you'll need to prove you've truly changed." "That's exactly what I want to do," he replied. "But I can't even reach her." "Perhaps that's intentional," Claudia said. "Beatriz may want you to take a hard look at yourself before she's ready to speak again." Arthur frowned. "I don't have time for guessing games, Claudia." "Then stop treating this like a game," she snapped. "You hurt her, Arthur. Maybe deeply enough that she doesn't want to see you again. Think about how you'd feel in her position." Arthur leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. "What do you suggest?" "Focus on what matters," Claudia said after a pause. "She mentioned she's been working on a history of the company, right? Start there. If she won't talk to you, her work will. And if you truly understand what she's trying to convey, maybe, just maybe, she'll see that you've changed." The next morning, Arthur returned to Ferraz Corporation's archival department. The files he had begun reviewing were now more than just historical records. They were windows into the lives of people who had built the company. Each story brought a new layer of understanding, but one narrative stood out above the rest: the establishment of a workers' fund in the mid-1980s. The fund, created to provide financial assistance to struggling employees, had been spearheaded by Beatriz. It wasn't just a charitable gesture, it was a lifeline for many during a period of economic instability in Italy. Arthur found records of medical bills paid, families supported, and even a small school funded in a rural town where many Ferraz Corporation workers lived. His heart sank as he realized that this initiative had likely come at great personal cost to Beatriz. Her name appeared on loan documents and contracts, often alongside Giulio's. The sacrifices she had made were far greater than he'd imagined. That afternoon, Arthur called a meeting with his executive team. The boardroom, typically a place of calculated decisions and impersonal discussions, felt charged with a different energy as Arthur entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, standing at the head of the table. "I've called you here today because it's time to correct a mistake, one that goes far beyond numbers or strategy." The executives exchanged puzzled glances. Arthur rarely spoke with such gravity. For decades, Ferraz Corporation has celebrated its success as if it were achieved by a select few at the top. "That narrative is false," he continued. "This company stands on the shoulders of individuals who have given everything, many of whom we've forgotten or overlooked." He paused, letting his words sink in. One of those individuals is Beatriz Rossi. Her contributions saved this company during its darkest days, yet she was treated with disregard, even by me. The room fell silent. Arthur's admission was shocking, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "To honor her and everyone like her, I'm establishing a permanent fund in her name, the Beatriz Rossi Foundation," Arthur announced. "Its purpose will be to support the well-being and education of our employees and their families. It's the least we can do to acknowledge the sacrifices that built this empire." The room erupted into murmurs. Some executives nodded in agreement, while others appeared skeptical. Arthur ignored the latter. For the first time, he felt he was acting not as a businessman but as a steward of something greater. Later that evening, Arthur returned to the archives, combing through more of Beatriz's files. One entry caught his eye: a list of names, employees who had benefited from the workers' fund she had established. Alongside each name was a note of thanks written in Beatriz's elegant handwriting. At the bottom of the list, a single sentence stood out: "A company is only as strong as its people. Never forget this." Arthur leaned back, her words echoing in his mind. He finally understood why his father had trusted Beatriz so deeply. She embodied values he had neglected for years: compassion, loyalty, and a commitment to the greater good. In the days that followed, Arthur threw himself into preparations for the foundation's launch. He arranged for the Workers' Fund to be reinstated and expanded, ensuring it would serve generations to come. He also commissioned a book compiling Beatriz's archival work, to be published as a tribute to the unsung heroes of Ferraz Corporation. But despite his efforts, Arthur knew his journey wasn't complete. Beatriz still hadn't responded to any of his attempts to reach her. He couldn't force her forgiveness, but he could ensure her legacy was honored. One evening, as he left the office, Arthur received an unexpected call. "Signor Ferraz," a soft voice said. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. "Beatriz." "I've heard about the foundation," she said. There was no anger in her tone, but neither was there warmth. "You've made a good start." "It's because of you," Arthur said earnestly. "You've shown me what truly matters. I only hope I can earn your forgiveness." Beatriz was silent for a moment. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Arthur. It's something you offer. First to others, then to yourself." Before Arthur could respond, she continued, "You've taken the first steps. Let's see where they lead." The call ended, leaving Arthur standing alone in the quiet street. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of redemption, not in grand gestures, but in the promise of change. As he looked up at the stars above Milan, Arthur vowed to honor that promise. The grand ballroom of Palazzo Cerboloni was alive with energy. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, illuminating the faces of executives, employees, and their families. The launch of the Beatriz Rossi Foundation had drawn a crowd from across Italy and beyond, each attendee eager to witness the event that promised to reshape Ferraz Corporation's legacy. Arthur Ferraz stood near the stage, his gaze sweeping over the gathering. The walls of the ballroom, adorned with intricate frescoes and gold accents, seemed to echo the grandeur of the occasion. Yet, for all its splendor, Arthur's focus was elsewhere, on a single figure seated near the back of the room. Beatriz Rossi. She sat quietly, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, wearing an elegant navy dress that matched her composed demeanor. Though her face betrayed no strong emotion, her presence spoke volumes. She had come, and for Arthur, that was more than he had dared hope for. When the time came for Arthur to address the crowd, he ascended the stage with a steady confidence. A projector behind him displayed photographs and documents from the company's archives, images of workers, construction sites, and handwritten notes from Beatriz herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice carrying through the room, "tonight we celebrate a turning point, not just for Ferraz Corporation, but for the values we stand for." He paused, scanning the room. For too long, we focused on the achievements of a few while overlooking the contributions of many. This company's story is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who has worked tirelessly, sacrificed deeply, and believed in a vision greater than themselves. A ripple of applause spread through the audience. Arthur took a breath before continuing. Among those people is someone who embodies everything Ferraz Corporation should strive to be. Someone who has dedicated her life to supporting others, often at great personal cost. He turned, gesturing to the image of a younger Beatriz projected behind him. Beatriz Rossi is the heart of our legacy, and it's time we honored her properly. Arthur stepped aside as a staff member brought out a plaque. The gold lettering gleamed. The Beatriz Rossi Foundation, a legacy of compassion, commitment, and community. "Beatriz," Arthur said, his voice softening as he looked toward her, "your work, your sacrifices, and your unwavering belief in this company have not gone unnoticed. Tonight, we honor you, not just with words, but with action. The foundation we launched today will ensure that your values guide Ferraz Corporation for generations to come." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding as Beatriz stood. For a moment, she remained still, her gaze locked on Arthur's. Then, with deliberate steps, she walked to the stage. When she reached him, Arthur extended his hand, but Beatriz bypassed it, pulling him into a warm, maternal embrace instead. The room erupted into cheers as Arthur felt a knot of emotion tighten in his throat. After the ceremony, Beatriz and Arthur sat together in a quieter corner of the ballroom. The hum of conversation and laughter surrounded them, but for a while, neither spoke. "You've done well, Arthur," Beatriz said finally, her voice calm but kind. "Your father would be proud." Arthur shook his head slightly. "I don't deserve that praise." "Not yet." Beatriz smiled faintly. "You've taken responsibility for your mistakes and are working to make things right. That is enough for now." He looked at her, the weight of years of misunderstanding finally lifting. "Thank you, Beatriz, for everything." She reached out, patting his hand. "Thank me by continuing this work, Arthur. This foundation is only the beginning." As she stood to leave, Arthur rose with her. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Beatriz gave him a knowing smile. "Perhaps. But whether I'm here or not, you'll know what to do." As the night wore on and the guests began to depart, Arthur stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Milan stretched endlessly before him, a reminder of both the weight of his responsibility and the limitless potential for change. In his pocket was a small, folded letter, one of his father's last entries from the journal. He had reread it countless times since finding it. "Arthur, one day, you'll understand that success isn't measured by wealth or power, but by the lives you touch. Lead with compassion, and you will never falter. Julio. Arthur tucked the letter away and gazed at the horizon. For the first time, he felt at peace, not because his journey was over, but because it was just beginning. Thank you for taking the time to join Arthur and Beatriz on this journey of discovery, redemption, and renewal. Their story reminds us that success is not built in isolation. It is a tapestry woven from the sacrifices, dreams, and resilience of many. If this tale resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might find inspiration in its message. And remember, like Arthur, we all have the power to lead with compassion and create lasting change. Let's honor the unsung heroes in our lives and ensure their stories are never forgotten.